This is Getting On With Life, Biblical Wisdom for Successful Christian Living. And this lesson is Toxic Thoughts. Have you noticed that things going nicely can be destroyed by some new piece of information or some change in attitude? We see that when relationships break up, partners become bitter rivals, a rolling success crashes, supporters walk away, etc. I want to point you to the 3 toxic thoughts that can destroy good things in your life. The 3 I highlight here are fear, resentment, and judgment. Consider Peter walking on the water to Jesus. He had asked Jesus to invite him onto the water, and when Jesus did, he stepped out of the boat. His faith was high, and he achieved something most people think only Jesus could do. Despite his success and the amazing experience he was having, he allowed the toxic thought of fear in. He saw the stormy waves and wind. He looked at the problems and the impossibility of what he was doing, instead of at the miracle he was walking in. Toxic thoughts of fear overcame Peter's faith, and he began to sink. Jesus had to pull him back up out of the water and walk him back to the boat. If he had never allowed fear to do its toxic work, he would be remembered for walking on the water, not sinking in it. The toxic thought of fear has disabled multitudes over the centuries and destroyed things that were already going wonderfully well for a while. It is an insidious invader intent on destroying faith and pulling down great achievements already in process. As soon as fear draws our attention to what can go wrong and how crazy we are, it pushes faith out of the way and saps our confidence to keep doing the wonderful things already in process. The Israelite soldiers of thousands of years ago were told to go home if they had fear. Fear is so toxic, it can be picked up by others around us. Deuteronomy 20 verse 8 records, "The officers will say to the people, 'Which of you is fearful and faint-hearted? He is to go and return home, lest the heart of his brothers weaken as his heart has.'" For your own sake, don't stick around fearful people. They will only undermine your own faith and confidence. Surround yourself with people of faith and those who are bold to step up and do things others wouldn't. Another toxic thought is that of resentment. It is easy to allow a negative thought or feeling towards someone who offends us. That kind of toxic thought leads to a root of bitterness, which not only defiles us, but harms those we are in contact with. Hebrews 12:15 warns us, "Be careful that no one fails to apply God's grace, or a root of bitterness will spring up and trouble you, and cause many to be defiled." We apply God's grace by extending forgiveness, patience, and tolerance, and by overlooking faults, rather than being offended by them. Resentment and a host of other reactions of similar tone represent us taking a stand against someone internally. We will be offended often and in varied ways. People will let us down, insult us, contend with us, and be annoyed with us, and often not for good reason. They will be intolerant of us, and we will be ready to respond in kind. If nothing else, we can easily take offense and feel negatively toward them. If we hold that negative feeling, we withhold grace to them. We fail to apply God's grace. The only outcome from that is that a nasty root begins to grow inside us. It's a root of bitterness. It makes us bitter, but it also pours bitterness of spirit on those around us. So resentment and all things like it are toxic thoughts. They are poisonous unless we quickly kill them off. If we hold the feeling of offense, it grows and gets built on by further thoughts. We begin to interpret all the things the offensive person does with suspicion and accusation. We have an example of resentment in King David's wife, Michal. She saw David prancing around as he brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. She was offended that her husband would behave like that. When David came home, she mocked him. 1 Chronicles 15:29 records, "As the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord came to the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David whirling and playing music, and she despised him in her heart." And 2 Samuel 6:20 says, "Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to David and said, 'How glorious was the king of Israel today, uncovering himself in the eyes of the maids of his servants, as one of the base fellows shamelessly uncovers himself.'" At the moment Michal felt offended at David, she could have reminded herself that David was a man after God's heart and was anointed by God to be a great leader. She could have honored him, but she chose not to. She could not comprehend that God is so much more worthy of honor than the greatest of men. Then there's a related area of judgment. This can be an extension of being offended. but it can also apply when we put ourselves in the place to judge others. That's pride of heart, where we think we are good enough to stand in judgment of others. Jesus clearly warned us not to judge others, or we will be judged. In Luke 6:37, Jesus said, "Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven." Judgment, like resentment, can spring up in our heart without warning. We will see or hear something and rise up within with indignation and a compulsion to pass judgment. We saw King David do that when he was presented with an abuse situation. The prophet Nathan was sent by God to tell of a man whose only lamb was taken and killed by a wealthy man. David reacted quickly in anger and passed judgment on the spot. He judged the man guilty and sentenced him to death without hesitation. 2 Samuel 12:5 records, David's anger was greatly aroused against the man, and he said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who did this shall surely die." Nathan then said to David, "You are the man." David had stolen another man's wife, even though he had several of his own already. David passed judgment on himself, and it was harsh judgment. So let's put those things together. Each of the three toxic thoughts I mentioned is able to overturn things that are going well. Fear will overturn faith. Resentment will overturn relationships. Judgment will overturn our own future, bringing us under judgment. Yet each of them can spring up in an instant. Fear can spring onto us as it did to Peter, who was already walking on the water. Resentment can spring up in an instant when we see something that offends us. And judgment can spring up just as quickly, prompted by our pride and anger. Our challenge then is to be aware that these are toxic thoughts. There is a terrible price for accepting them. They are a poison cup which we must not drink. Yet if we are not attentive, we can have sipped before we realize what we are drinking. I call these things to your attention to warn you and prompt you, for your own good, to call on God to protect and deliver you from things that do you harm. May you walk humbly with God and be forever free from toxic thoughts. God bless you.